Welcome. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of Macquarie University land, the Wadamadigal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured this land since the Dreamtime. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future. We welcome people of all nations and all faiths. Kwai Bidja, Jamna Payala Janawi. Come here, we speak together. We have 60,000 years of archaeological evidence of Aboriginal habitation at Lake Mungo and 20,000 years in Ryde. We have great antiquity. Today, hundreds of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people graduate from Macquarie University. The Darug Nation had famous leaders such as Chief Yarramundi, Naraginji, Colby and Maria Locke. Many of the descendants of these Darug people live today amongst you. We celebrate with you our ongoing attachment and custodianship of this country. We celebrate the achievements of Macquarie University.
Wonderful. I'd like to say hello to everybody and welcome you to today's event. My name is Melissa Ryan. I'm the Director of Incubation and Entrepreneurship here at Macquarie. And also Susan Mills is a co-host here who heads up Macquarie Alumni. I'd like to welcome our alumni members here today and thank you very much for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing from our guest speaker, Richard Kimber, who's the CEO of Daisy. I'd like to start off today to let everybody know who Macquarie Incubator is, or what we are and what we do. Here at the Macquarie Incubator, we develop and provide a supportive environment and deliver education programs. We develop networks of mentors, investors and industry experts to help startups on their journey. We also support our innovators, which are our researchers here at Macquarie University. And a lot of people ask why university? And I think for us, it's around our two core functions. We're the natural home of innovation. So we have researchers in high concentration with pathways for commercialisation to deliver real world impact. And we're also education providers. So they're the two reasons that the university is involved in entrepreneurship and why we're also supporting startups and innovators around solving our greatest challenges, as we're all more and more aware of through climate change and also inequalities through our society. We're also about building economic diversity for Australia and ensuring that we have companies like Daisy that are developing the new jobs of the future and the new ways of doing. So I'd like to introduce the Daisy CEO and founder, Richard Kimber, who has more than 25 years of global leadership experience with a background in technology, finance, business, and now entrepreneurship. So in 2017, Richard and his team founded Daisy, a multi-award winning Australian AI software product company focused on voice analytics technology. Since 2017, Richard and the Daisy team have been awarded several industry-leading awards, including winning the DXC Technology InsurTech of the Year and was the 2019 InsurTech Startup of the Year winner at the FinTech Awards and was also included on the 2019 KPMG Global FinTech Top 100 list, which is basically one of only 7 Australian companies in that 100 list. So prior to starting Daisy, Richard was CEO of OFX Group, one of the world's leading international payment and foreign exchange companies listed on the Australian Securities Exchange. Before this, Richard was the first regional managing director of Google in Southeast Asia, including Australia and New Zealand. While at Google, Richard led the region's commercial and country operations, more than doubled its multi-billion-dollar revenue and managed the local integration of the YouTube and DoubleClick acquisitions. Prior to this role at Google, he was the chief executive for First Direct Bank in the UK, which also was the UK's first online bank with 3,000 plus call agents servicing millions of customers. So this call centre exposure was a pivotal moment for Richard as he nurtured his interest in voice analytics and started Daisy nearly a decade ago. So thank you very much, Richard, for joining us today, and I'd like to pass over to you for your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And great to be here. And thanks everyone for joining. I will just pick my screen to share and check that that's coming through. All good. Perfect. All right. So I'll just start by kicking off, I guess, by also saying that, I'm very honoured to be here and to speak to alumni and the members of the innovation group at Macquarie. I am an alumni. Both of my degrees were from Macquarie, and my undergrad was in psychology and statistics, and that really, I guess, got whetted my appetite for the whole idea of AI and machine learning. Back in the day when I did it, though, we had the mini-tab computers, which were actually mainframes. So when I did my undergraduate degree, there wasn't even a laptop invented. So it shows you how old I am. And when I did my MBA through the MGSM, most of our assignments were typewritten. So that just gives you another sense of how long ago that was. But a great experience and a real pleasure to be with you today. My career, I guess, has been somewhat unusual in many ways, in the sense that I've worked around the world in a variety of different countries, and also in a number of different industries. But the core theme that I've always focused on has been around change management, and being, I guess, at the forefront of how technology impacts business. And I guess when the topic we were discussing the topic for today, and the idea of speaking about AI, I got very excited because it's something I'm very passionate about. And my biggest challenge for today is to try to condense all of the ideas into a less than an hour. It's one of those topics, I guess, that you could talk about forever. So what I'm hoping to do today is to really give you a sense of why AI matters, what's important about it, and from a practitioner's perspective as well, someone who's really embraced it in my company and made it the core of what we do. Some of the challenges, some of the pitfalls, as well as the vast opportunity that I think it presents. So that's going to be the area that I'm going to focus on. I'm also going to give a bit of a global perspective, because I think when we're sitting here in Australia, it's very easy to watch the Channel 9 news every night, and Peter Overton doesn't talk about AI much. There's a few good news stories about to try and cheer us all up through the pandemic, but I think what we really need to look at is the broader perspective, and there is a phenomenal international story about AI, and I think we don't really spend enough time in Australia thinking about it. And when you think about AI, it's been characterized in a number of different ways, but probably the most important is that people talk about it being the fourth industrial revolution. Now, when you think about that, that's a massive claim, and it's something that is very foundational. And the World Economic Forum has actually written quite a bit about it and described why. And when you think about that, the word revolution, it speaks to what is actually happening here. This is not just something that's a nice technology to have, something like Wi-Fi or whatnot. It is a fundamental structural change. And one of the things that we studied in my MBA was the difference between cyclical change and structural change. And cyclical changes come and go, but this is a change that is going to be fundamental, and it's going to change the way that we work, the way that we innovate. And in fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about jobs, and the fact that we talked a little bit of discussion around the jobs of the future. That this particular area is one that's going to have more impact on careers than I think anything we've seen, and certainly in my lifetime. So very exciting, but also it has a number of other disruptive connotations to it. And when I started thinking about the strategy of AI, strategy is a great concept in a way, and having a clear strategy makes choices obvious, and that was kind of one of my takeaway from studying strategy. And at the end of the day, if you don't have a strategy, it's the old story. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And it's the opposite with AI, in the sense that you actually really do need a strategy, and Australia needs a strategy. And what happened with me that really got me thinking about this is Daisy, my company, won an award, which was called the Tech Rocket Ship Award, to go to the UK. And we were very excited about that, and I went off to the UK to learn about what's happening in the technology industry there. But importantly, what I found was that what was happening in the UK isn't happening in a haphazard way, where you've got entrepreneurs, investors, all operating kind of in splendid isolation. But what you've got is a very coordinated and organised activity around particularly AI. And I think it's interesting as well, because in Australia, we often think about the US as a country to look at for inspiration, and also China. So both of those countries have very famously invested enormous amount of money in AI, but it's the UK that I think actually holds a few interesting insights for us. And what the UK have done is they've talked about the grand challenges that put the UK, its strategy as a country into focus. And interestingly, you'll see no reference to Brexit there at all. That's kind of old history, old news now. And what the UK is focused on is 4 grand challenges. And if you think about it, these are pretty universal, and they apply to Australia as much as they do to the UK. And the first one is AI and the data revolution. So they've actually put AI as the #1 challenge that the UK must confront and deal with. The second is to become a world leader in mobility. And there's been a lot of discussion around self-driving cars and infrastructure and all these sort of things. And you can even have Uber helicopters now that are self-manned, that's going to take off in Texas shortly. A shift to clean growth, which is obviously a big topic here in Australia, and of course meeting the needs of an aging society. So it's really interesting when you think about AI in the context of the challenges facing the country and the people in the country. And the second piece is, well, what are the foundations of productivity? And interestingly, in our tech companies, we talk about OKRs, objectives and key results. Well, imagine having that for a country. And that is, I think, pretty important. And if you think about it, what are the overarching objectives and what should they be for Australia, and how does that relate to AI? Well, importantly, ideas are put at the top for the UK. And the UK has an ambition of being the world's most innovative economy. And if you think about that, I mean, what a grand objective, I think, very aspirational and something that everyone can galvanise behind. But importantly, it's actually about the people, which is about creating good jobs and a greater earning power for all, which is obviously the so what. It's no good having great ideas if it doesn't turn into a benefit for the community. And then obviously it implies infrastructure and the increasing improvements around that, the business environment. And importantly, they talk about places and prosperous communities across the UK. And this is one of the interesting things we've seen with the work from home phenomenon with COVID, is that places has become an interesting opportunity, which is Australia is very concentrated around the eastern seaboard and around Sydney and Melbourne. But actually, there are a lot of great places to be in Australia, just as there are in the UK. So it does start to make you think a little bit more about how do you actually have a strategy around the geography of the country. In terms of their strategy as well, another objectives here is to make London the European capital of AI. Imagine if Australia had an objective for, let's say, Sydney to be the Australian capital of AI or the Asian capital. I think that's the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about. And what the UK have done is they've now broadened that strategy into something called Tech Nation, which is basically a technology strategy for the whole country. And they've broadened it beyond London. And I think that's really important. And in fact, what they've done is they've said the Centre for AI is not London, it's actually Cambridge. And Cambridge makes a lot of sense because of its ties to universities. And I think that's why it's really apt to talk about the link between universities and innovation and strategy, because I think the linkage is absolutely important. And for the future of AI in Australia, we need to think very carefully about how we link the agenda in the university sector, the agenda in the business sector, and in fact, what we as a country want to achieve. Interestingly also, they're talking about 16 centres for doctoral training. So it's not just one place where the universities are going to aim to produce 1,000 new PhDs in AI, and which is really interesting and really important, because at the heart of AI is this enormous opportunity to innovate and to create new approaches to old problems. And that's why I think AI is so exciting, because what it's giving us is a completely new tool to address existing and old challenges. And that's what I want to talk a little bit more about. Of course, there are some very famous technology companies, and I had the pleasure of working with Google, as Melissa said in the intro. And I worked at Google, over 10 years ago. So Google was still a relatively small company when I worked there. I was the 50th employee in Australia, and when I left, there were 500 people. So it just gives you a sense of how. And now there's thousands. But interestingly, these companies, the FANGA companies, and Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, are all consistent in that they have all decided to be AI first in their strategy. And that's really interesting. And you can read any one of these companies, they talk about they are AI first. And Sundar said famously in 2017, we're moving from a mobile first world to an AI first world. And if you think about that, that's a pretty fundamental shift, and back to this idea that this is a structural shift. And the reason these companies in particular, I think, have been so successful is the access to data that they have. And the data, I think, is the foundational difference. And when AI was first talked about, everyone said it's the secret algorithm. It's the search algorithm in Google that makes Google so unique. Well, actually, that search algorithm now is quite widely understood. Page ranking is something that you can download off the internet now. So it's not the algorithm, it's the data. And the data that these companies have is in some ways, very, very unique. And it's a big issue for us because, none of those are Australian companies. So they're all American companies. There are very big equivalent Chinese companies as well. But when you think about the impact that this has had, and particularly through this period of the pandemic, and look at the stock performance of these companies, there's a very clear correlation here between their stock and financial performance relative to the rest of the world. They are gapping the world, and they are actually creating a new kind of company that has, effectively across them, no debt, enormous balance sheets, and the capacity to invest in AI at a pace that is literally mind-blowing. So I think for Australia, we need to take note of this, because it's not like this isn't happening by accident. This is happening for a reason, and it's happening because these companies are putting AI first, and it's very important for us when we talk about our future how we actually pick that up. Now, that was a very long introduction to what is AI, but I think that context is very important, because when you start thinking about it, this is not just a funky new way of making computer software. It is actually something that's completely new and unique. And what I wanted to do was just spend a quick minute just talking about the difference between traditional software and AI. And AI is written about all over the press, and you'll see it, people talk about it. And in fact, one of the challenges for me is that every startup is now an AI company, which frankly just isn't true. But people are overclaiming and saying that every company is an AI company. I think that would be great. So don't get me wrong, I would love it that all Australian startups are AI companies. That would be awesome. But I don't think we're quite there yet. So the main difference between machine learning, which is a key subset of AI, is that machine learning effectively use algorithms to train models to predict outcomes. And that's very different to how normal software works, which is a very systematic way and a rules-based way. So basically, normal software says, if this happens, do that. Whereas in AI and machine learning, it's not codified what you do. So basically what it does is it basically recognizes a pattern. And what machine learning is at its core is a pattern recognition engine. And the more data that you serve the algorithm, the better it gets at recognizing the pattern. And I think this is really important, because by just understanding that difference, what it helps with is understanding that AI is not perfect. And so by definition, it's never going to be perfect. It's going to be very accurate, but not perfect. And in fact, it's also it's worth noting that people aren't perfect either. So often, we talk about the accuracy of our semantic engine and how accurate is it. And if we can get to 95% accuracy, that's actually considered human level accuracy. So humans are not perfect. So it's very important to have a calibration around what a human can do. And humans are, obviously the most sophisticated beings that exist on the planet. So it's very difficult for a software solution to be able to emulate the capacities of a human. But what we are seeing is near human and better than human performance in a number of AI related tasks. So it's not that AI isn't working, it is working really well. It's just that it isn't perfect in many scenarios. And this is the challenge with self-driving cars, because at the end of the day, it can drive better than a person, but it can't be perfect. And that's the problem that we solve for is, how do you actually deal with the insurance and all the other, related issues? It's not to do with the car and can it be self-driving? It's all to do with all the other legal issues that it's holding us back. But the other thing I wanted to mention was the hype cycle. And, obviously we've been working with Gartner, which is a well-known, B2B, an independent research agency. And they talk about the hype curve, because one of the things that's, I think, important is not to overclaim or overfit the fact that AI can solve all problems, because it just can't. And in fact, one of the common conceptions is that, and there are a number of people who have talked about this idea. In fact, it's been made the topic of many movies, the idea that singularity is near, which is, that basically humans and computers can just interface seamlessly. I don't personally think that's anything that's going to happen anytime soon. But what is possible is around prediction. And I think prediction is really the area that I think has made huge advances. And I think that's something I want to talk a little bit about in terms of the capacity for business. And I do want to talk about AI at the core of competitive battles, both for companies and of course countries, as I've said. And I just wanted to show what is the hype cycle. And this is the kind of it's a bit like an adoption curve, where it talks about innovation at the beginning. There's the peak of inflated expectation, then you go through the trough of disillusionment, the slope of enlightenment, and then the plateau of productivity. So I don't want to labour the point around all of these different topics and different data points on here, but I would say that interestingly, some elements of machine learning have now crossed over the peak of inflated expectations, and some of them are disappointing. So things like chatbots, I think, have disappointed. And I think will continue to disappoint because they're trying to do too many things with a limited technology. What is exciting though is computer vision, and I'm going to talk a little bit about computer vision and natural language, which I think are sort of two of the areas that have showed the greatest promise. If you look forward also out to the right of this chart, you'll see there it says GPU accelerators. And that is an area where I think the future of AI is being powered significantly by the power of GPUs, which are the graphical processors used in gaming computers. And they help with parallelization and making AI much faster. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Another really important aspect, I guess, of AI is the idea that AI can augment people. And I think this is a concept which talks about human in the loop. And I think this is exactly the reality that we face, which is AI is fantastic at doing certain things. And I think what it's doing in its absolute best light is actually taking away tasks you don't want to do. So on the bottom left there where it says, do it for me. These are fun, basic tasks like schedule a meeting, find a place where we've all got open times on our calendars, or do less bad work, which is less paperwork, less mundane things. And then as you get more advanced, do things with me, help me be better. And you think about what services like radiology services where AI is helping radiologists to do better work and more of it and become more productive. So I think for me, this is the short-term benefit is really around productivity and getting more out of our days and getting less of the work that we don't want to do off our table. I did want to talk a little bit about an actual example of a model. And I wanted to do this just to put a bit more flesh on the bones, because talking about a model in abstraction, doesn't mean a lot to a lot of business people or entrepreneurs. Like, what is a model? So one of the most common models is Word2Vec. And Word2Vec is a very well-known model that's been around for a long time. But in 2013, there was quite a big breakthrough around the way that it works. And what it does basically is convert words into an abstract representation. And so by abstracting words, you can then compare words and phrases using a concept called vectorization. So it's words to vectors. And what a vector is basically an angle. So if you think about a three-dimensional box and you've got all the words in the world kind of in this three dimension, what you're looking at is the vector connection between the meaning of the words. And by doing that, what you've got is the capacity to understand the relationship between the words in a numerical sense. And I wanted to just give this example because what it does is it helps to kind of bring to life what is a machine learning model and how does it actually work. So I want to give the example here in a word-to-vec model where you think about 3 words. And what it does is it basically looks at the word embedding, which is a way of abstracting the words into a different representation. So the 3 words here are king, man, and woman. And if you look on the right there and you look at the colors show you a different way of thinking about the words man and woman. And you can see there that there's commonality between the word man and king and commonality between the words man and woman. In fact, the man and woman look more similar in terms of their representation than the woman and the king do. So there's obviously a closer relationship in terms of those 2 words because they represent a concept of gender. So that just gives you an example about how you would change the representation and understand the relationship between the concepts. You can then take that forward in looking at it in a wider sense and actually look at it a bit like a DNA fingerprint. And this is just expanding the idea. And then what you can do is you can actually then say, well, show me from a logical perspective, how do I look at relationship between words that are not related and those words that are related to actually infer a relationship. And this is the idea behind machine learning and AI, which is help me to predict the next outcome. And when you think about when you're typing an email these days, there's a word suggestion tool which helps to actually inform what the next words are. So it's effectively taking the insight from what you've typed to what it anticipates you're going to do. And in this example, it then says, well, I wonder what the representation will be and the relationship between the words man, king, woman, and queen. And in fact, what you can do to do this is actually create an example here where it shows you, if I do king minus man, add woman, I then get queen. And so this is an example where if you look at the colors of the chart here, you can see the relationship between the words on the top. You then take away the man, and you can see that the color of the red changes, and then you get the word queen. And you can actually see graphically and visually here how you've taken some pretty abstract concepts around gender and king and queen, and you can see the relationship. And the interesting part about this is the little approximation before equals, because it's not exact, but it is more than likely to be queen. And so what I wanted to show there is that is exactly an example of a word-to-vec model. And the more information you give it around what a king looks like, how a king behaves, how a man works, how a woman works, how a queen works, and the words around that will help to train the model better. So I hope that helps to give you a sense of, what is an actual model in reality. And then I want to talk a little bit more about now why this is important. And I think, one of the challenges with AI is, firstly is obviously the hype that came from and many people talk about the false dawns, which are kind of, the early ideas, and people got ahead of themselves around, well, this is going to change the world and all the rest of it. And in fact, AI is being tagged all the way back to 1956. But the reason why AI has come of age now and not before is obviously because of the digital revolution, which was the third revolution, where all of the information in the world has become digitized. And that's through things like the internet, as well as the capacity for the services to be delivered through the cloud. And I believe the cloud is the thing that's actually really powered AI. And that's what makes it accessible and affordable, because up until the cloud became ubiquitous, it was very expensive to actually productionize AI. So it's extremely important that those things happen to make this all possible. So that's why AI is not going away, and it has finally come of age. In terms of real examples and the future of AI, again, I've put down here some categories and then some of the examples of the services. And many of these that you'll be familiar with around knowledge, reasoning, and perception. And I think that's important to sort of think through kind of all of the different areas. And when you start actually putting your mind to it, the potential for AI is actually very, very wide. And we've seen, a lot of activity in medical diagnosis and a lot of talk around autonomous vehicles. But I think actually, for me, one of the more exciting pieces is around communication, and I'll tell you why. The reason for it is really around the pace at which you can innovate. And talking about Macquarie's innovation, like facility there, I think this is really exciting because what AI is going to do is allow us to effectively increase the velocity of innovation. And that's really, if you really want to boil it down, that's the benefit of AI. In terms of the applications, as I mentioned, I think there's enormous scope. But really where AI has its most impact is on unstructured data. And unstructured data typically exists in the fields of vision and voice. So if you think about it, those are the two areas that really create just an enormous volume of data. And unstructured data is a concept that's very important to understand around AI. And actually, one of the interesting things is that 80% of corporate data will be unstructured by 2025. Like, that's a huge amount. When you think about it, how companies are organized, most of the systems in a company, the accounting system and all the rest of it, are all tabular. They're all based around organized data. But actually, where machine learning and AI can make the biggest impact is actually on all the other stuff that typically isn't well organized. And I think that's one of the big challenges with AI is how do you organize unstructured data? And in fact, how do you take advantage of it? Because that's where all the really good stuff is from my perspective. And that's why I think the CRM systems of the future will be much less about what you put into the system and much more about what the systems detect about your customers. They're going to be much more autonomous. We're not going to see this idea that humans need to feed a CRM. We're going to have a CRM system that's going to guide us. So that's pretty exciting. And I think that's something that we're working on already. But I think it's something that's going to change how we think about systems within a corporate structure environment. And if you think about this rise in unstructured data, the next thing that is really interesting is the volume of data. And this is a big data problem. There's this whole talk about big data. Well, what is big data? This data is the generation of, this is a bit fuzzy, this chart, I apologize, but there is an exponential rise in the unstructured data being created. And what we're seeing today is there's around 40 zettabytes of data. And what is a zettabyte? A zettabyte represents every grain of sand on Earth. If every grain of sand was a piece of data, that would be 1 zettabyte. So we're talking about that volume. Imagine how much sand is on the Earth. And that shows you the volume of data that's going to be created just in the next 5 years. It's going to grow by 135 zettabytes. So this is a big opportunity, but it's a big challenge. And in fact, if you think about the implications, and this is really where the rubber hits the road, is around occupations and what we do. McKinsey predicts 60% of occupations and 30% of activities will be automated by proven AI technologies. So this is a pretty fundamental statistic. And when you think about the industries that affects, it's industries where data is at the core of the industry. And I've spent a long time in my career in financial services in various guises, and financial services really is right up the top there. Financial services, insurance, retail, interestingly, trade, professional services, and healthcare is another massive area. So the future is definitely going to be changed, and roles will change because of AI. Insurance is an industry that I spend a lot of time looking at, and insurance is interesting because when you talk to someone who works in insurance, they describe what they do as the business of risk, because that's what insurance is. It's understanding risk, and understanding risk in a way that you can then price risk. And that, if you think about those two tasks, they both require the synthesis of massive amounts of information. And so the traditional approach was to look at history and to create these things called actuarial tables, which kind of very nicely summarized the past. But of course, they don't tell you about the future. And so that's why I think the future of insurance is going to be completely dominated by AI, because you're in the business of risk. You want to know what's going to happen, not what happened. And that's why there's a fundamental change in the insurance industry. Similarly in health and in law, health is a really interesting area, but law is an interesting one because, there's such huge competition to get into law school. My daughter recently started university, and, you had to literally get 99.9 to become a lawyer. So, amazing competition to get in. I don't know how many of these prospective lawyers have thought through the impact AI is going to have on law. it's going to fundamentally change law. And I think for the better. And that's a big call, but having dealt with numerous contracts and other things in a legal context, whenever you're talking about IP and discovery and innovation, you're not far away from law. And in law in itself is a pretty clunky kind of industry, I think, and a lot of it relates to paperwork and long words and writing things down in cumbersome way. And it's very exciting to see how things like contract review can be streamlined and improved using AI and machine learning. So I'm excited about the opportunities to improve the whole category of law and to make it less of a point of friction in business. And I think that's something Australia needs to think about is, how do you use AI to take away regulatory burden and take away the impact on companies and make it easier to innovate? Because the challenge with law is, it's a great element of protection, but it can get in the way of doing business. And I think that's ultimately what we want to avoid. Optimization is another sort of generic business benefit, I suppose, of AI and machine learning. And there's some great research into the benefits of optimization that AI can deliver. And there was a great piece of research done by a company called Blue Yonder that showed that a 1% increase in price increases profit by 10%. So the AI algorithms are not just nice to have, they can have a dramatic impact in how you treat your go-to-market and how you optimize across your segments. Of course, it's important as well in terms of churn prediction. And it's obvious, and we all learnt in marketing, that it's much easier to retain a customer than it is to get a new one. And so actually fundamentally at its core, being able to retain your customers through using machine learning and AI is something that's a fundamental use case and something every company wants to do. The other thing which is well talked about, I think, is Netflix. And I know Netflix has been getting a pretty good workout through the pandemic. And obviously everyone's been spending more time optimizing their viewing patterns. But I don't know how many people realize how much AI goes into those recommendations. And these recommendations are interesting because it's not just about what you want to watch next based on what you just watched. It looks at so many different factors. And it's an example, I think, of how content can be customized. And this is one of the great benefits of AI, is that not only is the media that we consume tailored to us, but it actually starts to predict. And what Netflix do here is they're actually designing their next shows based on the predictive elements of the AI algorithms. So they know what formats work, and they also know where the content of the future needs to go. So the entertainment industry is completely changed. Spotify as well, uses very sophisticated algorithms, and these kinds of solutions, I think, have tried to predict in the past, but have not quite gotten there. But I think again now have really gone through a fundamental shift. So what these impacts, I think, have is a very big impact on competitive advantage. And when we did strategy, studying the Michael Porter models, the 5 forces of an industry, I don't think he envisaged the impact AI could have on these 5 forces. And when you think about companies that win and companies that lose, it's really interesting to look at the makeup of the New York Stock Exchange top 100 companies and how that shifted over time. And I showed the stock chart before about how these AI first companies have rocketed in value, but they've rocketed in value while other industries have declined and have suffered. And I think that's the interesting story that we're seeing here, is we are seeing companies and industries completely changing as AI starts to come in. And what it's doing is compressing this cycle of creative destruction, where companies that shouldn't survive are going to fail quicker. And that's interesting too, because it's creating quite a 2-speed sort of set of industries out there. And as Australia thinks about our recovery, I really hope that we put technology and AI at the core of what we focus on as we think about the opportunities. And the challenges in this strategy obviously are around broadening the awareness and understanding of what is AI and machine learning and how does it actually work. And I was saying to Melissa before we started, it's not all about the STEM science, and we don't all have to learn data science to become conversant in AI. We do need some scientists and researchers, and we do need some PhDs, but we don't all need to be studying that. I think the key takeaway for me anyway is that AI is something we all need to embrace. It's something that CEOs need to embrace, that boards need to embrace. It's not something for your data science department. I think importantly, all companies need an AI strategy. And I think I'm looking forward to the day that in the ASX annual reports, there's a page that says, here's our AI strategy, not just our business outlook or our financial outlook, but what are we doing about AI? And I think the day when we see BHP, and some of our bigger companies actually talking about their AI strategy will be a good day. And I think the important thing also is looking at use cases that are relevant today for companies and being able to actually make sure that you get results quickly. And I think that's obviously an important way as you get down the journey. I've got an old framework for change here, which is a little bit of a slide which I like, which basically talks about the things you need to manage change. And I think this is really relevant for AI because any change journey requires vision, skills, incentives, resources, and an action plan. And if you don't have a vision, you just have confusion. If you don't have the skills, you have anxiety. If you don't have incentives, you can get resistance. And if you don't have the resources, you can be frustrated. And I think each of these are kind of obvious, but it does speak to all of the things that we need to collectively move the ball forward in AI. And I think particularly for me in Australia, we need a greater increase in the vision around the potential for AI for all of our industries. I'll just spend a minute talking about Daisy, which is my company. And also, I guess, the concept of how, many people talk about SaaS, which is software as a service, and why I think AI is a great application as a service type of situation, because what it allows you to do is continuously evolve. Every one of your customers is on the latest version of the software, and it allows a very rapid release cycle. It lowers the cost of entry for your customers because they don't need to develop the AI. It can be purchased or rented. And so it has considerable benefits around the cost. So you can pay as you go, and there are a number of downstream integrations. I mentioned about the awards that we've won, which is sort of so what in a way, but they are important in terms of recognition. So we are happy to be recognized. And I just wanted to bring it home with a description about what we do. So it's, I've mentioned the word to vec model, and I wanted to show you what we do. So what we do is we monitor conversations in contact centers, and we listen to the call recordings. And you will often have heard this call could be recorded for quality purposes. More often than not, it isn't. So we've created a software that actually monitors all of the calls. And what we do is we transcribe the calls using machine learning from words to text. We clean and enhance the output. We then apply a layered set of machine learning algorithms and heuristics using NLP, NLU, which NLP is natural language processing, NLU is natural language understanding. And some of the models that we use include things like word to vec. And what we then do is a phrase matching, and phrase matching uses the construct around using phrases to derive meaning. And the idea behind the machine learning model there is that the words around a word tell you the meaning of the word because they give you context. And from that idea, we can then automatically score the call and tell you if something is a high risk call or not. So that is the example of a real world application of the AI. The point of that then is we can then turn that into a prediction around what's going to happen. And for me, that's the exciting part about AI is it's not just about what happened, it's about what's going to happen. And that's the exciting thing, is taking our software away from being a tool of record or a big data set of what did happen into helping business leaders of the future predict what they should do and where they should aim. So I'm conscious I've spoken a million miles an hour and I had a lot to cover, but really what I wanted to finish on was to really say that the AI arms race is on. The gun has gone off, and Australia is at risk of being asleep at the wheel. So I did want to kind of speak to the point that we are very much in a global race. I think everyone on this call has a role to play in exploring AI further, and I think it's one of those areas where every little bit helps. So I'm very pleased to have been able to share my thoughts with you today. And I think everyone here can do their bit to advance Australia's cause around AI. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm also happy to take any questions. And I can't see any of the questions myself, so I might ask Melissa or Nicola to point me to where I can see the questions.
Oh, no problem. We can read some out. We've actually got one from Felipe in our team, who's actually said, thanks for the amazing presentation, Richard. What would be the first steps for people to get started in AI and ML related careers? Yes,
that's a great question. I think in terms of the careers, I would say that the first couple of steps would be around some of the great online resources around learning a little more detail about AI. And what I've encouraged my team to do is there is actually some really interesting material put out by different countries, and actually Finland have put out an online course on AI, which is free to all citizens, and in fact it's free to anyone. And it's a great course because what it does is it kind of brings through all the concepts in a kind of an online way. And Finland have the ambition to have every one of its citizens trained in AI. So I think, that's a great, and back to the OKR is a great way to get started. In terms of the AI journey from a career perspective, I think there are different routes to come in. And a lot of people come in or start from an analyst perspective, a business analyst. So I think a BA type of role is a good foundational role. I think that's a good one in terms of understanding the basic ideas around data structure and the business problems that matter. We've seen other avenues as well from marketing. Certainly marketing, I think, is another area where areas like campaign optimization, there's a lot of opportunities around that. Finance is another good entry point. We've seen a number of people come out of what would be typically a management accounting type of role into looking into the statistics and predictions around demand, budgets and so on. So I think there are a variety of ways that you can come in.
We've got another question here from Alan, who says, how can small companies compete with FAMGA when they will never have access to so much data to learn from?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's all about specialization, and I think having worked in those big companies, they have to be quite selective in the problems that they choose to solve, and so that's one of the reasons that I've picked the area we have, which is quite a specific area around speech and spoken voice analytics. So I think the answer to that is you've got to be able to have access to a unique data set. And one of the challenges here is that the data has become, obviously one of the barriers to entry. So unless you've got access to, a relatively unique data set, it is quite difficult to get started. And what people often talk about is this idea of a cold start, where unless you've got a bit of data, you can't train a model, so you can't get started. So what's needed to happen is you need kind of enough of a data set to get the ball rolling. And so that's what I often encourage is get a sample data set, create a way of starting the analysis of the problem. Example data, can be as simple as human annotated scoring of a particular exam, or it could be any kind of survey. Data can come in many different ways. So I think looking at structured data around and tag data are typical ways that smaller companies can have an advantage.
Great. Olga's also asked you about sharing the link around the course from Finland, but we may have to follow you up around that, Richard, and then we can share that later.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah.
We've also got one of our founders here in the incubator who's actually in the armed forces.
Oh, great.
Their business and has retired from the armed forces, him and his co-founder, and he's got a statement around the importance of AI, saying that United States Department of Defense has committed $4 billion to AI and ML R&D for the year of 2020 alone.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. We were over at in the Austrade landing pad in San Francisco, and within that there was a whole track designed around serving the US Department of Defense, and the idea behind that was really for the US Department of Defense to access new technologies, and not just from established companies, because one of the challenges they face is that one of their suppliers, for example, is a company called Lockheed Martin, but they're a very big company. And so they're not necessarily innovating at the pace of smaller companies. So in the US, they've definitely identified that they want to work with startups and scale-ups to help to move quickly. And so I think it's very encouraging. And actually, Austrade can help any Australian company to get accredited. So we did look at that, and we've been doing a small project with one of their departments.
I've got a question here from Hasnain. Thank you very much, Richard, for such an insightful presentation. What are some of the best and interesting applications you have seen in learning and development?
In learning and development?
For AI, yeah.
Yep. Well, that's an interesting one. So there's many. I think one of the ones I'm excited about is a company that I saw recently that was optimizing curriculum for children with special needs. And that in particular was taking into account their particular capabilities. So I think for me, using AI to predict content and to help guide learning journeys for people with special needs is something that I think is a really big opportunity, and something I think they're an underserved community, and one that I think machine learning can make a big difference. I think in terms of other advances, I think there's been some incredible advances in the way that information is organised around video. So I think as a medium, the idea that you can access the best lecturers in the world, remotely on demand. So this is the advent of MOOCs, where you've got this idea that you don't necessarily have to. Every university doesn't have to have the one world expert on that AI topic. For me, it's pretty exciting that we can all access information from anywhere. And in terms of the other aspect to it is I think one of my bugbears is always teaching people through rote learning. I much prefer real examples and creating actual learning opportunities that are more situationally based. So I think that there's a great opportunity to create learning opportunities for people that are more experiential and less around rote learning. And remember this date, and I still remember 1016 Battle of Hastings. I still don't know why I need to know that number, but it was instructed into me for so many years. But I think AI is going to help make learning more interesting and more immersive. And so that sort of opens the topic around augmented reality, all of those things that I didn't touch on at all. But the whole computer vision space is fantastic. So if you think about learning to become a surgeon, imagine being able to do virtual surgeries, where you're cutting open a chest for the first time, but it actually isn't it isn't a human, it's actually an avatar or whatever. So imagine being able to learn that way. I think that's a really exciting opportunity, and I think that would also help people to get up the curve more quickly.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks very much. I mean, just thinking about that blows my mind. I mean, how many people, and I think they do a bit of that with remote surgery as well. Very specialised stuff, which is incredible when you get to actually witness that. I've got another question here from Ashwin. He's actually works in the AI field and has seen that companies are hesitating to share their data, say for training purposes specific for their needs, especially due to fears around data breaches and PII concerns. I think that's what that is. And how has Daisy addressed these concerns?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Basically that's one of the challenges around accessing data. So what we've created is basically an arrangement where the customer owns their data. And what we do is obviously then work on the data to train it into a derived output. So we ensure that all of the data is encrypted, and that when it's transformed, it's not accessible without the algorithm and the key. So effectively, what we do is make sure that the output is very different to the input, so that the risk of a data breach is much lower, and also that even if it was breached, it would make no sense without the encryption that is applied to it. And so what we do also is, there's a number of security questions and security protocols around how we ingest data, how we store it. And one of the things we do is we have a completely segregated database for every customer. So there's no chance of customer data being transposed with a different customer. So there's an information security and architecture approach that we take as well. But I'm happy to take other questions on that, offline if someone wants more detail.
I've got an interesting question here that's very, it's a very vertical related one. I've got Stephen here, who's a radiographer and own 2 radiology practices, and wants to know how you see AI disrupting the medical imaging industry. As he's saying, he can see AI eventually assisting radiologists making their reports by highlighting areas for them to concentrate on, but he struggles to see how AI will replace the human brain with diagnosis, since it takes 5 years post-medical school to train as a radiologist.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, in the early days of looking at AI, I looked very carefully at radiology, and in particular, we did an experiment and some work around brain imaging, in particular CT scan. So where I see AI, and there are a number of AI models on this already, is helping. So for example, in a CT scan, there's 100 slices or 100 views. So what the AI can do is help to triangulate which of the views to look at, and then can actually shorten the time it takes to focus in on the issue. And it can then also effectively give you sort of a prediction or its kind of inference as to what the issue might be. And in that example, we were looking at brain tumours, and we were comparing some data that had been human scored or human evaluated versus the algorithms. And it was very, very close to human level accuracy. So I think in terms of, the future, I would expect that the machine learning algorithms will be very, very similar to human output. And the 5 years of post training, I think that, an AI system can be trained on literally millions and billions of images and outcomes. So the difference, in some ways, AI uses brute force to overcome human intelligence. So, an AI system can be trained on 5 billion brain images. A human couldn't be trained on that many. So, we have great capacities of synthesizing data, whereas the machine learning algorithms are very, very good at assimilating masses of data. So they would literally take 5 billion images and be able to know what the outcomes were.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, we'll probably wrap up with this last one, because I think it's the hairy, audacious question that a lot of people skirt around when it comes to AI, and that's the ethical frameworks when considering the implementation of AI into society, from Neil. I think that's part of the great big question that a lot of people have around AI.
That's a really big issue, and we take it very seriously. And I've been invited to Australia. Australia has a committee for ethics in AI, and the Human Rights Commissioner has gotten involved as well. So I think there's 2 angles and 2 answers to that. The first one, I think, is that obviously privacy is something that's very important to all Australians, and that's part of our fabric. And so I think it's important that AI continues to preserve that right. I think the 2 ways that we can do that are around explainability and traceability. So all AI models need to be able to be explained. And so what that means is that you can then be able to work out what the data was that trained that algorithm, which version of the data, and what the outcome was. So within my company, what we do is we keep a very extensive log of the data that was used, the algorithm that was used, what version was used, and so on. And within that, we also ensure that basically that there is a framework around how the AI is used. So I think there is actually some global standards around the use of AI. It is a big issue for Australia, though, because I think particularly with the lower awareness of it, there can be discrimination, and it can be conscious or unconscious. And so it is a big issue. It's not something we've got all the answers for. I don't think we've solved it yet. And it's something that we all need to be very aware of. And, I guess at the end of the day, it's even, it's been seen in the US election. It's been seen in a number of other areas where the companies that are unregulated may need some form of regulation. So that's another question is, do these FANGA companies need some form of regulation? Because, the power of access to our data, is pretty immense. So I think it's not just a question about, will they be regulated? It's a question of when. So yeah, that's my particular view on it.
Right, thank you very much, Richard. I think I speak for everyone that we really enjoyed your presentation. I think it took us through so many aspects of it in such a user-friendly manner. You have a wonderful communication and presentation style, and I think everybody really enjoyed it and can understand, you know, the amount of intelligence that you bring when you do speak and explain a very complex subject matter.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd also like to let everyone know that Macquarie Incubator's applications for residency are open again at the moment. So if anyone wants to join in the revolution, the entrepreneurial revolution and innovation revolution, then we're here to help you. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us once again, and also all of our alumni for joining us today as well, and all the other interested parties that were able to come along. I didn't know if Susan wanted to say anything as the head of our alumni.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you everyone that's taken the time to join us. And please follow all of the activities Melissa has on at the incubator. She's got some great programs, so definitely take advantage of that resource.